All right, welcome back to Serial Killers. I'm going to get a little further in this PowerPoint. So two cases that I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to revisit this slide. So first of all, there was, I had mentioned cross-dressing, okay, and how cross-dressing can be, it's a sexual fetish, but once again, my opinion on sexual fetishes, and this is just my opinion only, if it's between consenting adults, who cares? It's really no one's business. Do whatever you want to do. So when I'm talking about serial offenders, I'm referring in terms of cross-dressing to an offender who would want to wear victim's clothing. So probably the best case example I have of that is from Canada. So hey, shout out to my Canadian friends. And this is the case of Russell Williams. So let me pull him up. Okay, so actually if we look back here, so here, let's see. So I'm just gonna show you a photo first of Russell Williams. So Russell Williams was a high-ranking official, in the Canadian Air Force. I mean, literally like the top commanding officer. And where he lived in Canada, there were a series of, first, it started out as home, just burglaries. And he would steal lingerie, usually from young women. Okay, so someone was breaking in, stealing lingerie. Local authorities were like, it wasn't a violent crime. Let's not worry about it. Well, then the offender escalated to not only stealing lingerie, but he would type creepy messages on the victim's computer, like, thanks, I had a great time in your bedroom while you were gone. He then would ejaculate or masturbate at the scene and leave ejaculate behind. So they, at least they had this person's DNA, couldn't figure out who it was. Okay, well then the offenses escalated into not only breaking into a house, but then if the victim was present, sexual assault. And then it became stalking to make sure that the victim was home instead of a crime of opportunity, and then sexual assault. And then finally escalated into murder. So Russell Williams was basically caught because of a tire impression. And he actually had no idea that he was even being investigated for this crime. But and let me show you, bring this up. Okay, so there were two murder victims, two homicide victims. And one was someone who actually was part of the Canadian Air Force, and they had flown together. The other one was a woman that he had stalked. And I had never even heard of this case. And the reason I heard of it is I attended a conference on secondary trauma, which is something that medical professionals, police officers, social workers, anyone who has to deal with horrific experiences, even if they're not, in the direct line of battle, they're still going to suffer psychological trauma. And the person who spoke was a forensic psychologist who had to look at the videotapes that Russell Williams had taken of him murdering his victims. And specifically this victim here, the way he murdered her was to wrap her face in duct tape, and then, her hands were bound, and then he just let her slowly suffocate. And this psychologist actually quit the profession and suffered, extreme PTSD because of having to observe that videotape, because it was so traumatizing and horrible. Okay, so that's how I heard about this case. So we're escalating to homicide. Okay, so remember, it started out stealing underwear, then stealing underwear, masturbating at the scene, then to sexual assaults of opportunity, then to stalking, sexual assault, and then finally to sexual assault, homicide. When I talk about cross-dressing, that's where this comes in. So one of the pieces of evidence against Russell Williams is when he would break into these homes, and I'm not sure if he must have carried a camera, with him with a timer, but he would put on the undergarments of the victims and had this very organized catalog of photos of him wearing the victims, whether it's a bathing suit or underwear. And when they, found this cache of photos, incredibly incriminating, but that was his way of taking trophies. So that's what I mean by creepy cross-dressing, okay? It's not typical cross-dressing. The other thing I just want to caution is, if you ever get cases where, someone is breaking in and stealing underwear, or when I lived in Chicago at my local laundromat, we had a person who would come into the laundromat and steal underwear, and bras out of the washing machines. And the local police was like, oh, ha, 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 isn't that funny? Oh, okay, well, first of all, maybe males don't realize bras are expensive, so we don't want those stolen. But also, it is a red flag that's not normal behavior, and that could be someone who's planning to escalate or eventually going to escalate to something. So keep that in mind. The other thing, and it doesn't involve cross-dressing, but there were a few cases that I worked in Chicago where someone would come into a scene and they would burglarize the home, and then they would, urinate all over the floor, or they would defecate on the victim's bed. And, those cases were kind of laughed at too because, they're gross and, why. But that's a person who is not only saying, hey, look at me, I broke into, your residence, I made myself at home, and I not only want to steal from you, but I want to instill fear in you and just, leave behind this message kind of control. It's the same thing with a person who makes themselves at home and kind of eats and drinks at the scene too. That's not your typical, I have a drug problem, I just want to steal things so that I can get money to support my habit. It's another level of creepiness. And so I encourage you future officers to, keep that in mind. Hey girls, do you mind going to wrestle in the other room? I'd really appreciate it. This is what I'm dealing with this morning, okay? All right. So the other thing I wanted to mention on that was the case of Jerry Burns, who, thankfully this was the case that was just solved using DNA. Actually, he was arrested 39 years to the day after Michelle Martinko was murdered. She was 17 at the time, murdered at Westdale Mall. So I've had discussions, seriously, girls, with friends, who for high school friends, we've talked about this. So if you remember back to this statement, that either, no matter which way the event goes, the feedback loop is bad for society. So either the murder is great and they keep doing it again, or something goes wrong and they want to improve it and they want to try again. So when you have a crime like Jerry Burns, I have a hard time believing that was his only offense. In fact, I'm really, really surprised that his DNA did not turn up in the database CODIS being connected to other offenses. His pornography history, which obviously, when this crime occurred, we didn't have the internet and we didn't have online porn. But since then, his internet history showed that he had a fetish for the stabbing and raping of blonde women with long hair, which is exactly the Michelle Martinko case, except Michelle fought back hard and she was not sexually assaulted. And luckily, fought back hard enough that his blood and his DNA was left behind in her vehicle. That's how he was caught. So she really solved her own murder, truly. But that would have been a case of, oh man, I have to change my MO because the knife obviously didn't work. The victim, if they fight back, I can cut myself. I wasn't able to sexually assault the victim, which is something I really want to do as well. So I am surprised that he didn't go back and, alter that MO and then go out and reoffend. Now, there are some reasons why, cases connected to him may not, be in the DNA database. So he may have decided after that time, I'm not gonna, this was in the media a lot. This was a typical high school girl who was loved by her family. Instead, now I'm gonna go after sex workers because they're much more vulnerable. They're not gonna make the media. Okay, that could be a case. He may have used a condom because, he didn't want to leave his DNA behind. So perhaps there was no DNA at the scene and no way to connect him. He may have changed the weapon he used. If he committed sexual assaults, but there was no homicide, sexual assaults certainly back then, and unfortunately this still occurs, are very, very underreported. Because a lot of times the victim thinks, no one's going to believe me, or I'm too ashamed. And especially if you're a sex worker, unfortunately there are agencies out there that are not going to care that much about, a person involved in illegal prostitution. They don't believe that prostitutes can actually be raped, which they absolutely can. So, I don't know, my theory, and this is my theory only, remember, I'm not a profiler, okay? I'm not, law enforcement. I did not investigate this case, but I have a hard time believing that this was it, and then he just stopped, okay? Because that need is so strong. Perhaps when online pornography became available, he was able to meet that psychological need by viewing violent pornography. I don't know, but I find that really surprising, and I don't really have, the answer for that, but I just wanted to mention it. Okay, so also when we're talking about serial killers, we have two categories that we can put them into: organized versus disorganized. Okay, so the scary people, the Ted Bundys, the John Wayne Gacy's, those fit into the category of organized serial killers. This is where there's a lot of planning, for a long time. The offender, looks normal, has relationships, may have friendships, usually married or has a significant other. For example, BTK, who we'll talk about, was a married father of two, was an elder in his church, worked as an animal control officer, was a Boy Scout leader. So they appear very normal to society. Because of their planning, they often carry a murder kit with them. So whether it's duct tape, gloves, because I don't want to leave DNA or fingerprints behind, a mask, I don't want anyone to recognize me, the weapon that I'm going to use. They also, remember, they have either average or high intelligence, and they study. They know about law enforcement. They know about forensic science. The one thing that will get them caught is usually their narcissism. So they may actually try to insert themselves too much into investigations, where it's a little over the top. And it's because they think, I'm just going to play with the police because I am so smart, they're just going to never catch me. And it's a game to them. So if you think of, let's say that you guys are, you're living in an apartment complex around Kirkwood, and someone in the complex is burglarized, and the police come to your door and they say, hey, did you see anything this particular day? Have you ever seen anything out of the ordinary? People hanging around, and you can't think of anything. And so the officer or detective hands you their card and says, well, if you think of anything, please give me a call. And what will happen is, if you think of anything, you'll give them a call. Okay, with one of these offenders, they would call anyway and say, hey, I'm pretty smart. Do you need any help with the investigation? Or, how's the investigation going? Like, they're a little over eager, and that's their narcissism coming out. And a lot of times that is what gets them caught, thankfully. So if you compare that with disorganized serial killers, now these are the ones that are they stick out actually in a population because they are usually profoundly mentally ill. So these are not usually psychopaths. They are people who are psychotic, and that's completely different from being a psychopath. That's an actual mental illness. So these are the people that they have hallucinations. They see someone, walking down the street and, oh my God, that's Satan. God is telling me to kill them. That would be an example, of a disorganized killer. And normally, these are not killers that are going to be able to go undetected or, be able to operate, say, for decades, like the Zodiac Killer, the Golden State Killer. They may be able to commit a series of offenses, a series of murders, but they're going to be pretty close together in time. There's not a lot of planning that goes into them. They tend to be more spontaneous. And one thing is that they are often going to commit their crimes right around where they live. And it's because, they are so profoundly mentally ill that they are, a lot of times, they're unemployed. Either they're living with a relative or they're living in a homeless shelter. They certainly, can't afford to have their own transportation. So their crimes are committed wherever they can take the bus or, within walking distance or close to their residence. So these types of serial killers are usually caught pretty quickly as opposed to organized serial killers. So now I'm going to go through psychological types of serial killers. And, do I expect you to know details, really, a ton of minute details about this? No, I do not. But, for example, if I were to ask you on an exam, BTK is an example of, what type of serial killer. Yeah, you should know that he is a power-oriented type serial killer. Okay, so let me go at least through power-oriented, because then we're going to hit about 20 minutes and I want to get this video uploaded. Okay, so the power-oriented are the worst of the worst, the really scary ones. They are sexual sadists, they are narcissistic, they are psychopaths, they have no empathy for their victims. It's basically all of those things that I talked about in what makes up a psychopath. So the first one I want to mention is BTK. Dennis Rader. And if any of you watch Mindhunter on Netflix, which I would really encourage because, first of all, it's based on, the true story of John Douglas, who was a profiler for the FBI and how the profiling unit started. Season 3, which, who knows when that's going to come out with the whole coronavirus thing, but I believe season 3 is going to be about Dennis Rader / BTK. So BTK committed sexually sadistic murders in Wichita, Kansas in the 1970s. And what's interesting is then he just stopped. Okay, so the law enforcement thought, well, did he die? Did he move away? Is he now incarcerated? Actually, he was living in Wichita the whole time. That's another thing. I don't understand why he stopped. Okay, but he's a perfect example of someone who was caught due to his narcissism, because in the 90s, no one in Wichita was talking about BTK anymore. And there wasn't that reign of terror, and he didn't like that. He basically wanted to be famous again. And so what he did was he sent a Barbie doll done up in bondage gear, where I don't know, I suppose you can buy anything, on the internet, but in the exact same pose and way of binding that one of his victims was, and that had never been released to the public. So he sent that along with a letter that basically said, I'm back, to the local newspaper in Wichita. And so they knew they were dealing with the right person. Dennis Rader is around my age group, so he was a boomer. And like a lot of boomers, we, as you well know, are not tech savvy, okay? So he didn't understand the concept that, hey, when you send an email, you can actually tell where that email came from. So the emails that he would send to the newspaper came from the church where he was an elder, and that's how they were able to, track him down. He also, his own daughter, contributed a DNA sample, which they compared against semen evidence from the scene to show that whoever had left that semen behind had to be the father of this young woman. And so that's how they were able to, kind of solidify his arrest warrant. So here is Dennis Rader. And there's his daughter, you know, so obviously maybe family life was not perfect. I mean, he just looks like a typical dorky dad. But you know, I think if law enforcement came to me and said, "Hey, we think your dad, you know, Bernie's a serial killer. Would you give us a DNA sample?" You know, there's no way I would think my dad was a serial killer. I'm probably going to say something to Bernie like, you know, what is going on? She said nothing to him, which leads me to believe that, you know, maybe that family dynamic wasn't as loving as, you know, you would think from this particular photo. So one of the most horrific crimes he committed was he murdered this entire family, the Otero family. So you had mom and dad, Joseph Sr., Julie, Josephine, and then Joseph Jr. And his actual target, and he had been stalking the family, was Josephine. And I'm actually gonna, first of all, I'm gonna post a couple of videos, you know, if you're trapped inside, you know, with the quarantine and you wanna watch something interesting. First of all, I'm gonna post the interrogation of Colonel Russell Williams. And those of you who want to become detectives, you gotta watch this interrogation because it is masterful. And it is by the same special agent who also interviewed Paul Bernardo, who I've mentioned previously and who we'll talk about in a little bit. But he basically comes in and Russell Williams is so arrogant. And then within the space of about 45 minutes, this special agent has very calmly reduced him to giving a full confession. So it's just, you know, in terms of how interrogations go, it's a thing of beauty. I think you can really learn from it, and it's really interesting. I'm also going to post BTK's confession about the Otero family. And one of the horrible things he did is, you know, he basically let the mom and dad and the little boy suffocate to death upstairs, and then he took the little girl down in the basement, hung her, and then post-mortem masturbated. I'm not sure if he committed necrophilia, but he, you know, did leave semen evidence behind, so the whole fixation was on her. So absolutely horrific. And when you listen to his confession, I want you to pay attention to his affect. And, you know, he could literally be telling you, giving you instructions on how to change a tire, you know, or how to, you know, grill a steak. There's no emotion. There's not the slightest bit of remorse. In fact, if anything, he appears, you know, to be kind of, you know, bragging a little bit. So, you know, that's not uncommon. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video there because we're at 23 minutes. And we'll pick up with Ted Bundy. Thank you.